Working in a morgue isn't as grim as people think. At least, that's what I used to tell myself. For the past 6 months, I've been pulling the night shift at the Blackridge County Morgue, a small facility tucked into the basement of the local hospital. It's not the kind of job anyone dreams of, but it's quiet, predictable, and exactly the kind of work I needed after everything I'd been through. But last night, something changed. It started like any other shift. I was at my desk in the intake room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee while staring at a stack of paperwork I couldn't bring myself to finish. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, the only sound in the otherwise silent building. I glanced at the clock. 11:48 p.m. Just me and the dead for another 12 hours. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I preferred it. But as I sat there, a strange heaviness settled over the room. The kind of quiet that felt wrong. The first sign came when the lights flickered. It was quick. A brief dimming, followed by a faint hum as they flared back to full brightness. The building was old, prone to power surges, so I didn't think much of it. But then I heard the whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind. The ventilation system sometimes carried sounds from outside, though there were no windows in the intake room. Still, the whisper was too distinct, too deliberate. I froze, my eyes darting toward the hallway leading to the storage room. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the corridor, my footsteps loud against the tiled floor. The storage room was at the end of the hall, a stark, sterile space lined with lockers holding the bodies I'd checked in over the past week. When I opened the door, the familiar scent of disinfectant hit me like a wall. Everything looked the same, neatly ordered, untouched. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A whisper, soft and close. This time I could make out the words. "Don't leave." I spun around, my heart pounding. The room was empty. For a moment, I just stood there, every nerve in my body on edge. Then I shook my head, trying to push the fear away. "You're just tired," I muttered to myself. "Get a grip." I closed the door and walked back to my desk, forcing myself to focus on the paperwork. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully, but the whisper stayed with me. By the time my replacement arrived in the morning, I was practically running for the exit. I told myself it was nothing, my imagination playing tricks on me after too many nights of isolation. But the next night it happened again. The lights flickered just after midnight, a quick flash that made my stomach tighten. I grabbed my flashlight immediately this time, heading straight for the storage room. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed the locker in the far corner. It was slightly ajar. I hesitated. I was sure I'd locked all the units at the end of my last shift. It was part of my routine. But there it was, the door cracked open just enough to see the white sheet covering the body inside. My pulse quickened as I stepped closer, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I reached for the handle, pulling the locker open. The body inside was still, its pale features half hidden beneath the sheet. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But as I reached to close the door, something caught my eye. A single word, scrawled in faint, uneven letters across the inside of the locker door. "Why?" I stared at the word, my heart racing. Had it always been there? Couldn't remember. I backed away, my mind spinning. The air in the room felt heavier now, pressing down on me like a weight. I shut the locker and returned to my desk, but the unease lingered. Every shadow seemed darker, every sound louder. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted. But as I stepped into the morning light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. It was short, just one word. "Leave." I sat up, staring at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't just in my head. Something or someone wanted me gone. The message stayed with me long after the glow of my phone screen faded. "Leave." I didn't know what to make of it. Was it a prank? A coincidence? But deep down, I couldn't convince myself that it was nothing. By the time my next shift rolled around, I was jittery. The memory of the locker door, and that single word, "Why?" looping in my head. The morgue felt different that night. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air was heavier, colder. Even the familiar buzz of the fluorescents felt sharper, grating against my nerves. I started my shift as usual, checking the intake logs and reviewing the records for the bodies currently in storage. That's when I saw it. Locker 34. The one in the far corner. I'd locked it at the end of my last shift. I was certain of it. But now, on the clipboard where I recorded the locker contents, the line for 34 was crossed out. Someone had marked it in red ink, adding a single word next to it. Moved. My stomach twisted. I hadn't moved anything. I grabbed the keyring from my desk and headed to the storage room. The fluorescent lights flickered as I opened the door, casting long shadows across the rows of lockers. Locker 34 was closed this time, but the sight of it made my skin crawl. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Inside was the same body I'd seen the night before. A man in his 40s, found dead in his apartment 2 weeks earlier. He had no known family, no one to claim him. Just another anonymous name on the roster. Except now there was something different. His hands. They were clasped tightly against his chest, as if in prayer. That wasn't how I'd left him. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. Tucked between his hands was a small scrap of paper, folded neatly. I hesitated, then reached for it, the cold of his fingers seeping through my gloves as I pulled it free. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, with faint creases as though it had been folded and unfolded many times. I opened it carefully, my stomach knotting as I read the single line written in jagged letters. "You didn't listen." I stumbled back, the paper falling from my hands. The lights flickered again, buzzing loudly before steadying. I glanced around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But I was alone. At least I hoped I was. I shoved the paper into my pocket and closed the locker, double-checking the lock before heading back to the intake room. My mind was racing. Who had written the note? The morgue was locked at night, and I was the only one on duty. The only one who had been there. Was someone coming in when I wasn't looking? Or was it something worse? I tried to distract myself with paperwork, but the image of the folded hands and the note lingered in my mind. Just after midnight, I heard it again. The whisper. This time it was louder. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, seeping through the walls, the floors, the very air around me. I froze, my pen slipping from my fingers. "Why didn't you listen?" The voice was low, rasping, as though it came from someone barely able to speak. I bolted to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and spinning around. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The room was empty. The whisper grew fainter, trailing off into silence. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding. Then I heard something else. A sound that froze the blood in my veins. The soft click of a locker door swinging open. I didn't want to go back to the storage room. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the keys and headed down the hallway, the flashlight beam trembling as it cut through the darkness. The storage room door creaked as I pushed it open. The rows of lockers loomed ahead, their metal surfaces reflecting the flickering light. At the far end of the room, one door hung open. Locker 34. I swallowed hard, stepping closer. The body was still inside, its hands folded neatly over its chest. But something else caught my eye. A small, dark stain on the floor beneath the locker. Blood. It wasn't possible. The body had been drained during the embalming process. There shouldn't have been any blood. But as I crouched to examine the stain, I saw it begin to spread, seeping slowly from beneath the locker. The whisper returned, louder now, echoing in the small room. "You didn't listen." I stumbled back, my foot slipping in the growing pool of blood. The flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the floor and spinning wildly. In the chaos of shadows and flickering light, I saw something. A face. It was there for only a moment, reflected in the metal door of the locker. Pale, sunken eyes stared back at me, and a twisted smile spread across its gaunt features. And then it was gone. I didn't stay to investigate. I grabbed the flashlight and ran, slamming the storage room door behind me. For the rest of the night, I stayed in the intake room, every muscle in my body on edge. I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. When my shift finally ended, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove to a diner on the edge of town. The bright lights and chatter of strangers a welcome escape from the darkness I'd left behind. But as I sat there, staring at my untouched coffee, my phone buzzed again. Another message. Don't come back. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The morgue wasn't just a job anymore. It was a warning I couldn't ignore. I told myself I wouldn't go back to the morgue. The message on my phone, "Don't come back," felt like a command, not a suggestion. Whoever or whatever was behind it clearly wanted me out. But staying away wasn't an option. The morgue was my job and I couldn't just walk away. I convinced myself that it was all in my head. The whispers, the blood, the face in the locker door. Stress, isolation, and too many hours alone in a place no one liked to think about. That's what it had to be. So the next night I went back. The building was eerily quiet when I arrived. Even the usual hum of the HVAC system seemed muted, as though the morgue itself was holding its breath. I walked through the intake room, avoiding the storage room as long as I could. But eventually, I had to face it. Locker 34 was still locked. I double-checked it, my hand trembling slightly as I turned the key. The body inside was just as I'd left it. Pale, still, lifeless. But the air in the room felt wrong. Heavy. Oppressive. I locked the door again and stepped back, my pulse quickening. That's when I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, a sickly sweet odor that grew stronger as I moved toward the corner of the room. It was a smell I knew well, the unmistakable stench of decay. But the morgue was temperature-controlled, the bodies preserved to prevent exactly this kind of thing. The smell shouldn't have been there. I opened the nearby lockers one by one, my stomach twisting with each pull of the handle. Each one was the same, cold, sterile, and undisturbed, until I reached the last locker. Locker 42. When I opened it, the stench hit me like a wave. Inside was a body I didn't recognize, a man in his 60s, his features bloated and discolored. But what struck me most was the condition of the body. It hadn't just decomposed. It had been mutilated. The chest cavity was open, the ribs splintered and exposed. The skin was torn, the edges jagged as though something had clawed its way inside. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. This wasn't how the body had arrived. Someone or something had done this. I slammed the locker shut, my heart pounding. For a moment, I just stood there, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I heard the sound. A faint thump from inside locker 34. I turned slowly, the blood draining from my face. The locker was closed, the metal door gleaming under the fluorescent lights. But as I stared, the sound came again. Thump. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped closer, my palms slick with sweat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as though something inside was trying to get out. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice shaking. No answer. My hand shook as I reached for the key, the cold metal biting into my fingers. The lock clicked open, and I pulled the door wide. The body was gone. The locker was empty, the interior cold and pristine. I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't possible. I'd locked it myself. I checked it, but the body was gone. I turned to leave, but the door to the storage room slammed shut. The sound echoed through the small space, and I froze. The lights flickered, buzzing loudly before plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness as I swung it wildly around the room. The lockers loomed ahead, their doors casting long shadows on the tiled floor. And then I saw it. A figure, hunched and motionless, standing at the far end of the room. The flashlight beam trembled as I pointed it toward the figure. It was the body from locker 34. Standing upright, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its empty eyes staring straight at me. "Why didn't you listen?" The voice was low, guttural, and it came from the body. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The figure took a step forward, its bare feet slapping against the cold floor. "Leave," it rasped. I didn't wait. I turned and ran, throwing open the storage room door and slamming it behind me. The intake room felt suffocating, the walls closing in as I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit. I didn't stop until I was in my car, the doors locked and the engine running. That night I didn't go home. I drove aimlessly through the dark streets. The image of the body's hollow eyes burned into my mind. Eventually, I ended up at a gas station on the edge of town, the bright fluorescent lights a welcome contrast to the shadows I'd left behind. I sat in the car for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no explanation. When I finally pulled out my phone, there was another message waiting for me. This one was different. It wasn't a warning. It was a question. "Do you believe me now?" I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Whoever or whatever was behind this wasn't going to stop. And they weren't alone. I didn't go back to the morgue the next night. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I needed the job, and I knew skipping a shift without a solid excuse could cost me. But the thought of walking through those doors again, of hearing that whisper or seeing whatever that thing was, made my chest tighten in a way I couldn't ignore. Instead, I called Sheriff Warren. The sheriff's office wasn't far from my place, and Warren was one of the few people in town I actually trusted. He was gruff but fair, with a no-nonsense demeanor that came in handy in a town like Blackridge. When I told him about the locker, the missing body, and the messages on my phone, he didn't laugh. He didn't even look surprised. "That place has always had issues," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach sinking. Warren let out a long sigh. "Before it was the morgue, that building was a clinic," he said. "Back in the 1940s. There was a doctor who worked there, Dr. Lionel Greaves. He ran the place, took care of most of the town. But there were rumors." "What kind of rumors?" Warren hesitated, then leaned in closer. "They said Greaves wasn't just a doctor. He was experimenting on patients, on bodies. People started disappearing, and those who went in for treatment didn't always come back out. The authorities eventually shut the place down, but Greaves vanished before they could arrest him." The story sent a chill down my spine. "And you think this has something to do with him?" I asked. "I don't know," Warren admitted. "But you're not the first person to say something strange happened in that building." That night, I sat in my apartment, the blinds drawn tight, the TV playing in the background just to fill the silence. My phone buzzed again around midnight. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The message was different this time. A photo. It was a grainy shot of the morgue storage room, taken from an angle that showed the lockers lined up neatly along the walls. Locker 34 was open. I stared at the image, my stomach twisting. The photo had been taken recently, the timestamp confirmed it. Someone was in the morgue. I grabbed my keys and drove straight there, my heart pounding the entire way. The building was dark when I arrived, the parking lot empty. I hesitated before stepping out of the car, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The front door was locked, just as I'd left it. But when I stepped inside, the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier. I walked through the intake room, my flashlight cutting through the shadows. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The storage room door was ajar. I pushed it open slowly, the beam of the flashlight trembling as it swept across the room. Locker 34 was open, just like in the photo. But this time it wasn't empty. Inside was a single object, an old tape recorder, its surface scratched and worn. I reached in cautiously, half expecting the locker door to slam shut the moment I touched it. Didn't. The recorder was heavy in my hand, its buttons stiff with age. I pressed play, the tape whirring to life with a faint hiss. At first, there was nothing but static. Then a voice broke through. "Why didn't you help me?" The voice was distorted, warped, but there was something familiar about it. I listened, my breath catching as the voice continued. He didn't stop. You could have stopped him. The tape clicked off. I stood there, frozen, the words echoing in my mind. Before I could process what I'd heard, the lights flickered and went out. Panic set in as the room was plunged into darkness. I fumbled with the flashlight, the beam flickering weakly as I shone it around the room. That's when I saw it. A shadow moving at the edge of the light. It wasn't a person, at least not entirely. The shape was wrong, the movements jerky and unnatural. It hovered near the far wall, its head tilting as though it were watching me. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The shadow didn't move, but the whisper returned, louder now, filling the room like a roar. Leave! I bolted for the door, my legs trembling as I stumbled into the hallway. The whisper followed me, growing louder, angrier, until I burst through the front door and into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. By the time I got home, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the keys to unlock my door. I sat on the couch, staring at the recorder, the words playing over and over in my mind. Why didn't you help me? The next morning, I went back to the sheriff's office. Warren took one look at me and nodded toward his office. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. I placed the recorder on his desk, my hands still trembling. Someone's in the morgue, I said, and they're trying to tell me something. Warren pressed play, but this time the tape was empty, just static. Looks like someone's messing with you, Warren said, but I knew better. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a prank, and it wasn't over. I couldn't go back to the morgue, not after what I'd seen, what I'd heard. The tape recorder sat on my desk at home, mocking me with its silence. No matter how many times I played it, the voice didn't come back. Just static, endless and grating. But the words lingered. Why didn't you help me? What did they mean? Sheriff Warren didn't believe me, or at least, he didn't think it was serious. He chalked it up to stress, maybe a prank from someone who knew I worked nights in that place. But I knew better. Whatever was happening wasn't a prank. It was personal. I spent hours going through old records, scouring the internet for anything I could find about Dr. Lionel Greaves and the clinic that had once occupied the morgue. What I uncovered made my stomach turn. Greaves had been experimenting on his patients, all under the guise of pioneering medicine. Local newspapers from the 1940s hinted at unspeakable practices, patients disappearing, unmarked graves discovered on the property. But the most chilling detail? There were rumors that Greaves had a private lab hidden somewhere beneath the building. A place where his experiments continued even after the clinic shut down. The morgue was built directly on top of it. Couldn't let it go. That night, I went back to the morgue, a crowbar in my hand and the tape recorder in my bag. The building was silent when I arrived, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. I stepped inside, the familiar hum of the fluorescents doing little to calm my nerves. This time, I didn't bother with the intake room or the storage lockers. I headed straight for the basement. The basement was mostly used for storage now, a forgotten space filled with old equipment and broken furniture. But I wasn't looking for what was there. I was looking for what wasn't supposed to be. It didn't take long to find the hatch. It was hidden beneath a rusted metal shelf, the edges barely visible under years of dust and grime. I pried it open, the crowbar scraping loudly against the floor. A ladder descended into darkness, the air below cold and heavy. I hesitated for a moment, my breath catching in my throat. Then I climbed down. The space below was small, no more than a few feet wide, with concrete walls that seemed to close in around me. The flashlight beam danced across the surfaces, revealing stains that I didn't want to think about and old medical equipment covered in rust. In the center of the room was a single table, its surface scratched and worn. And on the table was a file. The file was yellowed with age, the edges brittle. Inside were photographs, black and white images of patients strapped to tables, their faces contorted in pain or fear. There were notes, too, written in a hurried scrawl that was barely legible. Subject 14, initial resistance to treatment. Progressing as expected. Subject 22, disposed of after failure. I felt sick. These weren't medical records. They were a record of atrocities. But the last page stopped me cold. It wasn't a report. It was a list of names. The first name on the list was Abigail Moore, the woman whose body I'd found mutilated in the locker. And the last name was mine. I dropped the file, my hands trembling. How could my name be on a list from decades ago? The answer came in the form of a whisper. You didn't help me. I spun around, the flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the room. The shadows moved with it, coalescing into a shape. A figure standing in the corner, its face obscured. Who are you? I demanded, my voice breaking. The figure stepped closer, the light revealing sunken eyes and a twisted, unnatural smile. You let him take us, it said, the voice hollow and echoing. And now you will join us. The air grew colder, the walls seeming to press in around me. I stumbled back, tripping over the edge of the table. The flashlight slipped from my hand, its beam flickering wildly. The figure was closer now, its form shifting and distorting as though it were barely holding itself together. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the flashlight and shining it directly at the figure. Stopped, its head tilting as if confused. Then it spoke again. Run. I didn't wait to be told twice. I climbed the ladder as fast as I could, the whispers growing louder behind me. By the time I reached the main floor, the entire building seemed alive with sound. Voices crying out, metal scraping, and footsteps echoing in every direction. I burst through the front door and into the night, collapsing onto the cold pavement. I never went back to the morgue. The sheriff's office investigated the basement the next day, but they claimed there was nothing there. No hatch, no file, no evidence of anything I'd seen. But I knew the truth, and I knew I wasn't safe. Epilogue. A week later, I received a package in the mail. Inside was the tape recorder. The tape had been replaced with a single slip of paper, folded neatly in half. On it, written in the same jagged handwriting as before, were 3 words. It's not over. Sometimes the dead don't rest because we won't let them. And sometimes they make sure we never forget.